Take your Bibles, turn to Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, starting at verse 1. Let me read this so we can get an idea of what we're going to look at this morning. It says, "Now after this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them out two and two ahead of him to every city and place where he himself was going to come. And he was saying to them, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go your ways. Behold, I send you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. Carry no purse, no bag, no shoes, and greet no one on the way. And whatever house you enter, first say, Peace be to this house. And if a man of peace is there, your peace will rest upon him. But if not, it will return to you. And stay in that house, eating and drinking what they give you, for the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not keep moving from house to house. And whatever city you enter, and they receive you, eat what is set before you. And heal those who are sick, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you." Stop there. This helps us to understand. This is not the full section. It all goes all the way to verse 20. This is talking about sending the 70 and them returning. What this has given us an idea of what God has planned as far as what he purposes in proclaiming the message and how he goes about it. And we'll learn some very important aspects about him sending people, commissioning people, and how they are to carry on. So this is mirrors. We've already looked at part of this because we see it mirrors the apostles, the 12 apostles, in providing a broad picture on how the disciples are called, how they are prepared, how they are sent out. This helps us to understand about how God does that very function. This also, keep in mind, follows the interaction from last week about the three men who wanted to follow or who were called to follow but did not. Shows about the need for commitment and following in a wholehearted way. See, these are the ones that we're going to look at this morning, are the ones who heard the call and followed. So there are specific tasks, specific times to which God calls us. He calls us to salvation. He calls us to follow his ways, but then he calls us to specific areas and tasks. And so we need to realize how that happens. We don't just decide, I feel like doing this morning and feel like doing that and I feel like doing this, and we call it God's will. What we see is a need to have a commitment and people to be evaluated in what they're doing. And we're also going to see how they accepted or rejected the message and how those who were sent needed to respond. So we'll find out they were given a clear task. They were given an urgent message and instructions about the danger of it. They were to travel light, rely on God, and keep on track. And so in verse 1, chapter 10, verse 1, we see the commissioning and the appointing of the 70. It says it came about while he was praying. Wrong side of the page. Now after this, the Lord appointed 70 others. Other than the ones that were already assigned. And he sent them to every city, and he sent them two by two, where he himself was to go. So what he is, give us a little background here, is he's going to send them out in the various areas before he goes to preach and proclaim the kingdom personally, and he goes and lets them proclaim and commissions them to go proclaim. They are preparing. They are also preparing themselves as well as preparing the way. He sent them out in a practical way, sending them out at two by two. But these 70s do not have any excuse. They are not hesitating, but they go and preach the gospel of the kingdom. They're appointed, prepared, and ready to go. So this is beyond the 12. This is not the 12 added into the 70. It was beyond the 12. So God appointed people to a particular task. If he wants something done, he wants something to be accomplished in proclaiming his message, he calls them and leads them. Just like in Acts chapter 13, verse 2, he says, set apart for me Barnabas and Paul, what? For the work to which I have called them. He calls those, he commissions them, it is his work to which he calls them. So he gives them some instructions about the coming harvest, and I think this is appropriate for our time as well. Not just, this is a kind of trial run for them, but in verse 2 it says, he was saying to them, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Notice the contrast. Therefore they are to do beseech or cry out to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. So the time was for hearing and then making a decision. Before the harvest is about that decision. So there are times he is saying that there is a harvest coming. The harvest is you're going to go and proclaim, then they're going to have to make a decision, and that decision is going to be solidified. The harvest, he says, is great or large or huge. And the contrast we see is that there's a sizable harvest, but there are a limited amount of workers. So what is this harvest? Is it judgment, blessing, or both? I think what the harvest is a time of conclusion. In its broadest sense, it's a time of determination and accounting. He tells the 70 to pray. Now notice this. He says to the 70 to pray to the Lord of the harvest, who's in charge of this accounting, in charge of this timing, in charge of determining the time that it is determined, for assistance and direction. He calls them. He's the one. There is a prayer made for him who is going to hold all people accountable. So both the harvest is both a judgment aspect and a rewarding aspect. It could have that both aspect. Sometimes what happens is and this mixes the divine side. We'll get to a minute about the harvest, but see how he mixes the divine side in both the sending and acting upon the prayers to send laborers. So what happens is God says, I want you to pray. So he initiates the people to pray. And then what happens is that he responds to those prayers, as well as the human side, which is to request. And then sometimes the requesters become the person who is sent. So God is both in charge of the harvest and is necessary and decisive for the sending of workers to provide the rescue. God, if he is sending, he will make very clear that that's what he wants you to do. And that's what he does. He asks you to pray about workers, and then he calls workers to go where he tells them. He will be the judge in the reckoning of all men, but he also provides the means to prepare them for it. So the means of prayer is critical, but again, God is decisive, essential, and active in causing all from the prompting of prayer to answer. So we remember this. God is not saying, well, do the best you can and maybe you'll figure out some people to go to. God is initiating the sending. He is calling people. He is initiating the sending. He is calling people to pray about the sending, and he sends them. And he's going to provide for them. So there's different types of harvest. Let's look at some of them. There is the harvest that is at the end of the age. In Revelation chapter 14, verse 15, This will help us to understand about the use and the picture. Remember, harvest is kind of like a metaphor because it's not like reaping wheat and stuff like that. This is talking about men and about people. And it says, starting at verse 15 of Revelation 14, it says, "And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, 'Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe.'" So here we have a future event taking place. Here's a dialogue taking place with the angels. And then the angel says, "Go and reap the earth." This is where you get the idea. This is a judgment reaping, but this is an accounting. This is kind of like, this is the time. No longer, this is the time to determine things. In verse 16, "And he sat on the cloud, swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. And another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven. He also had a sickle." The another angel says, "The one who has the power over fire came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, 'Put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe.'" This is the time of ripening. This is the time of readiness. Put this sickle in. Look at this judgment. "So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God." So what happens is there's this future time. God's going to determine that this is the final time for these on the earth. He will reap the earth, take those that are the false, and throw them into judgment. So that is the harvest before the coming of Christ. Another one is in Matthew chapter 13. This is Matthew 13:39. "And the enemy who sows them," that is the tares, that's mixing in this time period, the mixing. But then it's described, "The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels." So this description of harvest is the time at the end of the age. I think it's talking about the same one we kind of looked at in Revelation, but we realize that takes place. What happens is the devil has mixed in with the kingdom appearance those who are false. And it tells us that in verse 30. And so what we have, they are allowed to grow together, those who appear to be, like they're part of the kingdom and are not. And God says there's a time of harvest and then a separation of those two. Now there seems to be a nearer one. This one is in John chapter 4, verse 35. There seems to be a nearer harvest in the time of Christ. It says in Mark chapter 4, verse 35, it says it like this. It says, Do you not say there is yet 4 months and then comes the harvest? So he's saying, this is the time period on earth for physical harvest. "Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are not white for harvest." So in the time of Christ, there is a decisive point of decision making that people are going to need, and then there's an accounting. So they're going to have to hear the message, then they're going to have to decide. If they don't decide, or if they decide not to decide and not embrace it, then the harvest, and it kind of like solidifies. It kind of brings accountability to it. So we have to realize, so you have the final accounting, you have nearer accounting in Jesus' day, and then I think there's even shorter ones, and this is in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7. And I think this is encompassed for all of us. And this doesn't have to do with necessarily eternally significant judgments, but has to do with consequences. In chapter 6, in verse 7, it says, "Do not be deceived." Don't trick yourself. Don't let somebody deceive you. "God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, this he will also reap." there are consequences for our choices and decisions. And they come to fruitfulness in this time period. The end of the age, that's way off. The time of Christ, we're not in that time. But I think even in our time, there are times at which God accounts people for where they at and brings consequences. It goes on to say this in verse 8, for the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. The one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. So this seems to encompass Christians are reaping eternal life if they sow to the Spirit. Christians will reap the consequences of their flesh if they are sowing to their flesh. If you sow to your flesh, if you plant things related to fleshly aspects, there is a time where you're going to have to eat the fruit of it. You're going to have to deal with it. So just because you don't kind of reap the consequences of your choices right away doesn't mean that the harvest isn't coming for you. God has given you time to repent. He has given you time to change that, time to deal with that. But if you don't deal with it, then it becomes solidified. It becomes a consequence, irreversible to some degree, part of the consequences. Say, for instance, you could say with money, I deal with money in a certain way, and I don't really address my issues about money, either the love of it or the saving of it, and then at some point, all of a sudden, the consequences come. It's like you could not pay your mortgage, and after a while, you're going to lose your house. They'll give you time, they'll give you a little bit of effort to try to make it right, but after a certain point, that's the only thing. It's already decided. You may be still living in your house, but the consequences that you are being evicted. So let's go back further to chapter 10 of Luke. And he gives them more instructions about the danger or difficulty. And he is sending out the few who are willing and called to go. And he says this, go. Behold, I send you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. So he describes, this is not friendly. This is not warm. The behold signals a needed alert. You need to be alert to the fact that some people may be false and dangerous, and that not everyone will be open and receptive to your message. So hear this commissioning. Those people are commissioning, realizing this. They're not going to be receptive. Actually, they're going to be wolves. He instructs them to go to cities, places where Jesus is going, and when they go, there is danger, there is difficulty, and there could be duress. Wolves are extremely dangerous, especially because they have appetites for lambs. So here the 70 are going out. They're going out into places, and they have to be under the realization that it's a dangerous thing for them. The wolves can be false teachers, deceiving people, or dangerous individuals. Acts chapter 20, verse 29 describes those who rise up at the church as savage wolves. He knows that such false teaching arise. He also, let's go over to chapter 10 of Matthew, verse 16. It adds us a little bit of extra there that I think is helpful in understanding this whole aspect of God's commissioning and the people that you're going to run into. And it says it in this way, verse 16. It says, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. And it says this, therefore be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. So they are to be cautious by being wise in the interaction with some people. Why? Because they could be dangerous. This is both urgent, this commission, and dangerous. They are to behave innocent, but think shrewdly. Not the opposite by acting shrewdly and thinking innocent. The idea is that people have wrong motives, wrong reasons for doing things. They were to be aware of people can be vicious, rejecting, and cruel. If you're called to be a pastor, you have to realize that's just part of some people, some places, and sometimes the cruelty is overwhelming to the pastor and his wife. And to realize why, because it's hostile. Because we don't always know those residing in the church whether they are wolves in sheep's clothing. But you're not supposed to treat everybody as if somehow they're all hostile right off the bat. And it's kind of like a predetermined assumption. Oh, everybody's going to do this to me, so I'm going to put the guards up. I'm going to be resistant. No, you're supposed to be innocent, unmixed in your dealings with others, but alert to the plotting of others, especially false believers or false teachers. So you don't be naive, but wise. Don't be too calculating, but genuine. And you have to keep that in mind. So he gives them this kind of commission to help them understand that this is part of the surroundings of it. He also gives them some specific instructions to teach them, back to Luke chapter 10, some instructions which he's somewhat going to change later for the apostles, but here he is teaching them to depend on him, the style of depending. And it says, chapter 10, verse 4, it says, carry no money belt, no bag, no shoes, and greet no one on the way. So they weren't to take money, a money belt. That's how they carried money, purse, wallet type of a thing. This is how they carried money. Money was heavy. Money was, you wanted to keep it around you. You didn't want to lose it. They were not to acquire money during their trip, nor put money in their belt. So they're really supposed to go without any predetermined resources. And the thing is that they were not even in Matthew 10:9. They were not to acquire money, not to ask for money, not to beg for money. They were just to have no money this time. They were to trust God in his provisions. You have to learn, if you're going to serve God in a capacity, missionary, in some ways, to trust in God's provision. You cannot be afraid. You cannot be fearful. They are not to carry extra bags. Okay? They are not to carry extra. They either also were not to have any shoes or not to just carry extra shoes. I think it's probably more extra shoes. It's kind of like, I don't think they could walk barefoot in that day, but I think it was just extra. Also, they're not to get involved in formal greetings. This was kind of odd to us because we're not used to this kind of greeting. But they were not to involve themselves in formal greetings that would distract them from their course. And the thing is that their mission was to go and preach. So it seemed like these greetings became huge sidetracks where they would get themselves involved in some sort of event type of a thing and couldn't get on to preaching. It doesn't mean they didn't say hi, and they didn't shake people's hands. This is a whole elaborate form of greeting. He says, you can't do that. So in a sense, you got to be a little bit rude. Culturally rude. I don't have time to do that. But because I got a mission. I got a responsibility. And you got to, as one sent from God, you have to keep yourself on track to realize what you have been called to do and carry out that calling. Regardless of, people want you to involve yourself in many other things. And in Luke chapter 22, he tells them to take more provisions. But what he does, he tells the apostles to take more provisions, but he says, but I want you to remember how I took care of you on the short term, and remember that that's exactly how you should trust me. This would provide encouragement that God can and will supply. It's when he tells you not to have anything and then he does supply, then you could put that in your memory to realize, oh, he does that. So what further does he tell them in chapter 10, verse 5? It says, in whatever house, Luke 10:5, whatever house you enter first, say, peace be to this house. This is important in delivering the message and about how peace is provided. They were to trust God in their leading, whatever house. He would providentially direct them to the house to enter. The house was not just a building, it was people. They're providing the shelter. They were to initiate the encounter and to pronounce or declare, peace be upon this house. Now, what is this peace? This peace is wholeness, completeness, a sense of God's grace. This peace was more than just a greeting, a common expression of formality. It would actually bring the blessing upon that house to which it was pronounced if it was left there. This is like saying, may God be with you. So when God is with a person, the blessing is with that person. This peace must have had a short-term benefit, some sort of immediate benefit to give evidence of a tangible way. So when they showed up, not only some sort of tangible peace would be provided. Now, the sense or the feeling of peace could be immediate, experiential, bring a calmness, tranquility, a harmony, satisfaction. On the other hand, the opposite of peace is conflict, chaos, distress, division, resistance, and alienation. So what happens is that peace comes to a house, and they are bringing peace to it, and peace would be provided. Sometimes it gives you the idea that there's a certain amount of extra chaos going on in every household, and the thing is that, and God shows his presence by bringing peace to that house, a sense of calmness. See, the greeting was meant to be turned into a reality, because if they went to preach and they went to a house and they told them about the message, then God would evidence that receptive to the messages internally, and I think externally as well, provide some sort of sense of peace. We are messengers that can bring actually physical and emotional tranquility to a household if they embrace the message. He also tells them further about the peace remaining. In chapter 10, verse 6, if a man of peace is there, or a son of peace, literally, your peace will rest on him. And if not, it will return upon you. So the peace or wholeness can remain with that man if he is a man of peace. So the verbal becomes actual when he is receptive. So in a sense, how I receive the message, say from the person who accepts him, how they would accept the message would be the embracing and bringing of this peace. If the peace returned and left and departed because they were resistant, indifferent, or rejecting. So a peaceable man, a man concerned and centered on the peace of God, is going to experience that peace. This is a man open to receiving, but they may not have been necessarily having received it yet. They brought peace to the son of a peace who is open to it, because he is predisposed, he is thinking that way. We are living in a world that doesn't have the peace of God, false peace. Some verses that you can think about here on Isaiah 59:8, it says, they do not know the way of peace. There is no justice in their tracks. They have made their path crooked. Whoever treads on them does not know peace. The hostility, the injustice, their path, these are people who are toxic to peace. Why? Because they are crooked in their way. Jeremiah says, and this also is true, superficial peace is offered. Jeremiah 6:14, it says, they have healed the brokenness of my people superficially, saying, peace, peace. But there is no peace. Just because you talk about peace, just because you express peace and talk in a nice, soothing voice, it's just superficial. It's the idea of a superficial word. You can word or wound that you might have, you just paint over it. You just put something on top of it. That's just superficial. Secular counseling is superficial provision of peace. It is not meaningful peace. You just need to have a good day. You need to have a good outlook on things. Everything will be wonderful. That's just superficial. If you aren't right with God, it's all just on the surface. Isaiah 48:22 says, there is no peace for the wicked. So whatever the wicked have, and whatever they call it, it isn't peace. It isn't peace. They don't have peace with God, nor they have the peace of God. Jesus says this in John chapter 14, verse 27, and he tells us of the distinction. What is the distinction between this world's offer of peace and his offer of peace? I know that it is different because it's this. Verse 27, peace I leave with you. It is something in which can be left. It is something in which can be experienced. My peace I give to you. It's given by God. Not as the world gives. It's distinct from a peace that they offer. Do I give you? Let not your heart be troubled. Let it not be fearful. Fearfulness and anxiety are not the peace that God offers. He doesn't offer superficial peace. So the idea is that we can be people of peace who offer a message of peace, and we can actually leave peace with people. It doesn't just attach to us alone, but be provided peace. Because Jesus gives it to us, and we provide that to others. People are desperate in need of peace. He tells them further back in Luke chapter 10, verse 7. In this one, he tells them about their accommodations. How am I going to get paid? How am I going to live? What is the circumstances going to be like if I get sent out as a missionary or go to a particular place? He says this, stay in that house, eating and drinking whatever they give you, for the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not keep moving from house to house. So, they were not to be picky about their provisions. These are not luxury hotels, but a house where people provide what they have. They are to stay put and not move around looking for better accommodations. This is just the place they're supposed to be in. It says, the worker is worthy of the wages he receives. You'll get what it's worthy of, what's fitting for what you're doing. This is talking about basic necessities, not extravagance. There should be no climbing the city's social ladder. They were to go from house to house, spreading the message, but they were to stick with their primary house as a base operation and place of residence. That would keep them from moving around, trying to, you should come here now and we can provide you better sleeping arrangement. No, you just, whatever God directs you, that's what you're to be accepting. When God gives you a certain amount of provision, you are to be content. The dissatisfaction with what he has provided, or the place he has provided, or the people he has provided is not fitting for the labor to which you are to work. You will receive what you deserve for the kind of service God gives you from the people he sends you to. The worthiness of the work you do will result in the wages fitting for that work. It just will come and fit together. You must trust God. No begging for money, no pleading for resources. That's what traveling teachers did, and that's what was forbidden in later church history, that they weren't allowed to go around begging. If they stayed too long, asked for money, they're a false prophet. Should be applied today. It'd be much easier to figure people out. He goes on, what do I do about receptivity? Chapter 10, verse 8. Whatever city you enter and they receive you, eat what is set before you. So, what happens is that you enter a city, it is receptive, and others might be rejecting, but you're to be caught. If they're accepting, then you can eat. I don't know if we think about it in our culture as much, but you're to be cautious about eating whatever is set before you in a town that is not receptive. In days in the past, and in some countries even now, it is very too common to poison believers and poison family members. And the thing is that, and they did it in the past. So the thing is that you don't get too much. If they're receptive, then be open to eating. If they're not receptive, be careful what you may be digesting, just because they send it over for you. There have been too many Christians and messengers poisoned by people to which they went to. And but the hot town is open and receptive, then you can proclaim and participate. So, let's summarize what we learned this morning. We need to find contentment in the ministry and service to which God has called us. It fits and it's worthy to what God does. Realize this, the message, even on a smaller scale, were received by some but rejected by many. But remember that you are a messenger of peace. You bring not just the absence of conflict, but a wholeness, a completeness that people need in a deep sense, because the wicked have no peace. And the rest of the society has a superficial peace. You can have and bring peace. Again, we're not offering superficial peace. We're not just saying everything's going to be wonderful and nothing's going to happen bad and nothing different. No, we're going to have peace with God and a peace from God. A peace that passes all understanding, providing that from God. Your peace, you can leave and bring to people, and it can stay with them. But if the message is rejected, your peace is pulled. Now think about that actually people's rejection and people's resistance, you offered them peace was shown and provided, maybe a temporary peace came, and then you took it away when you left. We also to trust in God's provision always and depend on his supply. We are to be aware that there are dangerous people hostile to the message who will attack. Therefore, we need to be discerning. There is a proper discernment we need to have. So we are to be wise but innocent. We are to be innocent in one way but wise in another. The idea is that we are to be open but not too open, in the sense of open to what is false. Remember that our message has eternal consequences. Decisions matter, for the harvest is happening and will happen. There is a reckoning. People can't prolong their decision. They can't decide that, I'm going to be wishy-washy forever. Ultimately, the consequences are going to come. In a short term or an eternal sense, but they're coming. So just because it doesn't happen to you, you warn people, you need to stop that, you need to do this. It may not come right away. And then all of a sudden the flood comes upon them. God's accounting. With that, we'll bow our heads, close our eyes, and consider this morning what is instructive for each one of us. Think about how this should fit into your thinking. Are you ready for the ultimate harvest, the ultimate time of accounting and responsibility, which God will draw the line and there will be no changing it? Are you ready? Have you really embraced the message of the kingdom? Have you rejected it? Do you experience the peace of God, or has it been taken away? The peace of God, which passes all understanding. It is so deep and profound. All true Christians know what this peace is like, at least it's at the point at which they believe in various times, but it is a peace that is hard to put into words. If you are a believer and are not experiencing that peace, then you have to ask for the one who provides it and deal with not substituting it for superficial peace. Peace. And realize also to be content. Trust God for your provisions. Lord, we bless you this morning for your provision for us and your calling in our lives. Various places and various purposes you have called us to carry out your commission for us. Lord, may we be found faithful. Lord, may we experience the very elements of your peace and the delivering of peace to others. And open up our doors of opportunity so that we might share the message of peace, so that people will experience the peace